This is Jerry Vandenberg with Joe Rich Fire Department. This talk was recorded on January 26th, 2021, as our practices are on Zoom during the COVID pandemic. The talk is about mental health and resilience in the fire department. And just a quick note before we get started, we started recording about 2 minutes into it, so we'll pick up there. And we've removed a couple of multimedia links from within this video and linked them in the show notes in case you'd like to go see those on your own. Okay, thanks for joining us.
So intrusive memories, this is characteristic of people laying in bed at night, reliving the memories. And the flashbacks are extraordinarily realistic. Typically people who have PTSD, it's not just a memory, it's actually re-experiencing the traumatic event. You can, all of your senses are alive to it. And so it's more than just memories, it's really re-experiencing the issue. Another symptom is avoidance. Of course, the avoidance is really a maladaptive coping strategy. It's just, and what it is, it's avoiding thinking about the event. Negative changes in mood, so lack of interest, helplessness, numbness, and detachment, and negative emotional reactions. So this is slightly different. Being on high alert, being amped up, having trouble sleeping, and having a lot of guilt and shame. But it's really that feeling of being totally amped up all the time, and what I'll refer to as hyperarousal. Another characteristic is that feeling of being broken or unrepairable, and that's a really, it's a really bad warning sign. That's when you know it's gotten pretty bad. But similarly, an inability to feel joy or love. These are all sort of characteristic, although the symptoms, as I say, vary quite a bit. So resilience is the ability to both avoid these conditions in the first place or return from them if you do experience them. And the tools that I'll be talking about today are really geared around avoidance and coping in the near term. But I'll stress again and again, if you're at the point where you're feeling a lot of these symptoms in a very strong way, you'll need to probably get professional help and go beyond what I'm talking about tonight. So the whole point is to try not to get there in the first place. So just so you know where I'm coming from, I looked at a lot of academic studies. That's kind of the world I live in. So I looked at the studies that have been done by university researchers, mainly on sort of large groups of people who have had seriously traumatic events. So that's, again, war veterans, first responders, and people with childhood traumas. But as I said, it kind of leads to the same types of issues and the same mechanisms in the brain, and a lot of the same things that you would do to help yourself for any one of those is all the same. Now, one of the things I noticed is that there's a huge amount of similarity between what you would do for PTSD resilience and what you would just do for general mental wellness. And so for those of you who don't know me, I've had all sorts of general anxiety all my life. And I've spent the last 15 years or so looking into all of these different methods for my own personal use. And so while I was reading this literature on PTSD prevention, it occurred to me that there's basically a Venn diagram of things that you would do for PTSD resilience and things that you would do for general mental wellness, and they're virtually identical. In fact, there's almost nothing that you would find in terms of tools or practices or actions that you would take for resilience that you wouldn't also do for general mental wellness, and vice versa. They're basically the same thing. So looking at critical incident stress, I just wanted to refer to a couple of other sort of pop culture sort of information sources that I'm using here. So Jeff sent me this video of this psychologist from Calgary who does about a 30-minute talk on sort of the trauma that first responders are likely to feel after the death of Sergeant Harnett. This was the Calgary police officer who was struck and killed on New Year's Eve. And she talks a lot about how other first responders, whether they're from Calgary, whether they're police, it doesn't matter, just kind of people who wear uniforms will react to that, and how their families will react as well. And so you can look up the full video for yourself later, but I'm going to just play about 4 minutes of this. I thought it was sort of an interesting, sort of a powerful little, talk about sort of what goes on in your brains, or our brains, couple of the things she was talking about there, I am going to touch on in the talk here. One is about encoding the trauma, and that's really what we want to avoid. If you're in some traumatic scene and you feel very supported and you have the right coping mechanisms, you're probably not going to encode that trauma. And when she's talking about encoding it, she's actually talking about your brain rewiring and essentially having that trauma hardwired into your brain, which is essentially what happens in PTSD. And so it's a matter of, number one, having the resources and feeling supported and being supported, but number two, having those coping mechanisms so that you recognize the symptoms coming on and have some skills to be able to deal with it if they do come on. Another interesting that she said there, and if you watch the whole talk, she says this several times, the body keeps the score. And what she's referring to is that book on the right. And that's a pretty huge book about various different types of trauma. And when I saw this video by her, I remembered I'd actually read this book years ago, and I went back and looked it up for this purpose and found a couple of interesting things in there that I thought I would kind of bring back into this talk. So one is that trauma rewires the brain for hyperarousal, and I'll talk more about that shortly. But when she's talking about the trauma encoding, it's literally rewiring your brain circuitry. Trauma damaged people hurt themselves and others. And one of the sort of scary pieces of trivia I learned from this book was that after the Vietnam War, there were more deaths caused by the vets coming home after they came back to the States than there were Americans killed in the war itself. So this trauma really stays with us if we don't deal with it and causes damage for years to come. Another one, another sort of sad piece of trivia, self-medicating leads to more deaths than gun violence or MBAs to this day. And that's self-medicating to deal with lots of different types of traumas. If you look at the opioid crisis, almost all of those people are dealing with some sort of trauma. The other one is PTSD is contagious. So it's not just that you want to be able to deal with it by, you want the skills yourself to be able to deal with it, but we as a group need to be able to help each other without sort of catching the PTSD ourselves from sort of suffering emotionally with somebody that we're close to. So we need to be able to help ourselves and help each other. Okay, so why do we get PTSD? Why are we so amped up? We're a very high-strung species as a general rule. And it's not just the odd person, but we've actually evolved to be very high-strung. And so I have a little thought experiment here. Say you're walking through the woods and you see a little black thing off in the distance. Are you the type of person that kind of jumps and gets startled and goes into that fight or flight response pretty easily? Or are you the type of person that just keeps on walking and doesn't really care? And so you keep on walking and that little black thing gets a little closer. You can't quite tell what it is. It's probably some kind of animal, but it doesn't really bother you. There's that little animal. At a certain point, some people might get a little nervous. You can sort of see the shadow of this little black animal behind the tree. Keep waiting, and all of a sudden the little black animal pops up. Oh, look, it's just a cute little bear cub. So somebody who was really amped up might have kind of run away at the start. Somebody who was totally relaxed might have stuck around and turned around and saw mama coming at him. So this isn't just a hypothetical. This would have happened millions of times in our evolutionary history. So of course, the person who is really prone to fight or flight would have run away, live another day, pass on your genes to your nervous sort of predisposed children. Whereas the person who's easy peasy, no worries, occasionally gets eaten, and as a consequence, our entire species is really prone to that fight or flight response. And so now here we are after 2 million years of evolution in the modern world. We typically don't have to deal with wild animals, although out in Joe Rich, that's still a thing. But as a general rule, most of the 7 billion people on Earth have to deal with things like deadlines at work, too many people phoning them and texting them while they're driving, and all sorts of other things that we have absolutely no evolutionary response to. So we get this fight, flight, or freeze. And so what happens when we see a threat, when our brain perceives a threat of any kind, we only have one response to it. We have that the the sympathetic nervous system. We don't have any other nervous system that can deal with threats. So we get a surge in adrenaline and cortisol. Our pupils dilate, that helps us see better. We get increased respiration, blood flow, blood moving to the larger muscles so that we can run and fight. We tense up, we sweat. And this is essentially what we feel when we get nervous about something. It's the same system. Our digestive system slows down and all of our energy is shunted towards that fight or flight. So this is essentially our only response to stress. And on a very short-term basis, if this is a helpful thing to us because we need to outrun some kind of wild animal, this is great. But if we don't bring ourselves down from this, this is when we run into problems. And so a lot of the times when we have a serious trauma, we go into this mode, but we don't come back out of it. And that's essentially the makings of post-traumatic stress. So we can deal with trauma. We're all first responders. We have to deal with trauma. Sometimes it's fine, sometimes it's not. So the response will vary depending on the event, depending on the person, depending on lots of factors. So we have this one person, this guy here was on scene. He saw something gory in the car, whatever, but he goes home and sleeps fine at night because he feels like he did a good job. He helped it out. He's satisfied with his day as a first responder. This other guy on the right, though, he goes home and he stares at the ceiling all night thinking, man, I'm a disaster. That was horrible. I've really screwed up, whatever his thoughts may be. Two of the same people with the same training, the same background, on the same scene, in the same department, go home and they have two totally different experiences. So why is that? There are a lot of factors that can change that. So one is predisposition. Again, we're typically wired to be fairly anxious people, but some are more anxious than others. So we have this predisposition. We're faced with a traumatic event. This activates our fight, flight, or freeze response. One of the big factors that will keep us in that fight or flight is a perceived lack of control. If we feel that we were placed in a position or that we put ourselves in a position, but then we can't control the outcome, that's a big factor that leads to PTSD. Similarly, if there's no closure on the event, if we feel that we're either trapped or we had to leave the scene without any kind of closure, seeing it end, knowing how it came out, these are both important factors, kind of risk factors. So both of these will leave us in that state of hyperarousal. And as we saw in that video, as she says, it encodes in us because we don't have that sort of support to help us kind of get out of that state. That leads to ego defense systems, which I'm going to talk about on the next couple of slides, which are essentially setting us up for PTSD. So the way to deal with this, some of the things that I'll be talking about are to look at all of these different factors and have some tool in place to recognize when they're going wrong and to help improve the situation. So in terms of risk factors, there are some risk factors I'll talk about in terms of predisposition. In terms of fight, flight, or freeze, there are some techniques that we can do that will alter our physiology and help us calm down. In other words, deep breathing, all of these techniques can actually slow down our system and deactivate our sympathetic nervous system and get us into a calmer state. In terms of the perceived lack of control, we can use goal setting and we can alter our locus of control. And these are things that help us sort of get a realistic balance on what we can control and to help us set some realistic goals for any given call that will both make us more successful in our role on the call, but also help us kind of set something realistic that we can take home and be happy about rather than think that we didn't do enough or think that we have messed up somehow. In terms of getting no closure, there are some procedures in the critical incident stress SOP, diffusing and debriefing, and these are procedures that we can use to gain some closure on a call if it's a seriously traumatic call that is giving us some problems afterwards. And then in terms of coming down from hyperarousal and in terms of checking our ego defense systems, we can use mindfulness and meditation. And that's specifically going to be in the app that I'm going to go through later. So coming back to these two guys, what are the big factors? There's actually 6 factors that will affect how likely either one of these two guys is to get into a seriously post-traumatic state. So resiliency factors are personality, traumatic baseload. In other words, how much trauma have you faced in the past and how much of that are you carrying with you? And I'm just going to borrow a metaphor that Chief told me a month ago that I've really stayed with me. It was quite a powerful metaphor, I think. And I think he said he got this from some of the Army talks he's had, that being a first responder or being in pretty much any uniform, over time, you're going to build up a weight of trauma. And being exposed to these traumatic events is kind of like wearing a backpack. And each time you have one of these traumatic events, it's like somebody put a rock in your backpack, and it's just going to get a little heavier over time. And every time you face another event, there's another rock goes in and it gets a little bit heavy, and you just keep carrying that. So that metaphor has really stuck with me. And I do think that there are ways you can sort of help each other get those rocks back out, help yourself get some of those rocks back out. I totally take the point that these things are additive, but there's definitely ways you can lighten that load. So that's what I refer to as the traumatic base load. Now, those two things, it's difficult to use fairly simple techniques to deal with those two things. If you're the type of personality or you have the type of traumatic base load that is going to lead to a high risk factor, that's kind of beyond what you can help yourself with. You probably either need help with that from a professional or something, but in terms of the next 4, there's actually some very easy, very common, very straightforward techniques that you can do to help yourself with those. So ego defense is really how your internal system deals with stress. Affect regulation is how your internal system can control your emotions, either consciously or subconsciously. There are resources in place. So that's a big factor in terms of a risk factor, is whether or not there are resources for you, both at the scene and afterwards. So that's something we can definitely control. And then having coping mechanisms is also a big risk factor. So lack of coping mechanisms. So these last 4 are things that we can actually really easily control ourselves. It's just a matter of knowing what the tools are. So I'll go through each of those 6. So personality traits, again, it's almost impossible to change your personality. And I do think that most first responders would have the type of personality traits that give them some resilience. In other words, I think just by virtue of the fact that you are a first responder, it's highly likely that you are going to be pretty well equipped in this category. I think most first responders I know are pretty assertive, pretty hardy, have a good self-esteem, sense of humor. And I'll use Captain Volk as an example here. When I first joined the fire hall here, I remember being amazed at Aaron's really good, dark sense of humor and thinking, I always wondered if he had a dark sense of humor and that's why he became a paramedic, or vice versa. He became a paramedic and developed that dark sense of humor. But either way, it's a really good coping mechanism to use your sense of humor if you have a good sense of humor. And then balanced locus of control. And the locus of control is actually the only thing on this list that you can modify relatively easily. So I'm going to talk more about that in a bit. Now, in terms of a traumatic base load, this is a really classic study called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. And there are 10 questions that are big risk factors for a number of mental health conditions. And I'm going to read them out because there's probably a few people looking at a smartphone and can't read a word on my screen. But as I read them out, count in your head and keep track of how many of these you would say yes to. So number 1, did a parent or other adult in that household often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid you might be physically hurt? So that's question 1. If you said yes, count a 1. Did a parent or other adult in the household often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you or hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? If you had a yes, add up another 1. Did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you or have you touch their body in a sexual way or attempt to have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Question 4, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special? Question 5, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you? Number 6, were your parents ever separated or divorced? Number 7, was your mother often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard, or threatened with a gun or a knife? Number 8, did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? Number 9, was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Number 10, did a household member go to prison? So that's the adverse childhood experiences quiz, and it's a series of risk factors that set you up for not just the things shown on the slide, but actually quite a few others. So lack of physical activity, smoking, alcoholism, drug use, missed work. These are behaviors that are typical for people who score high on the adverse childhood experience. And by high, I actually mean 4 or more. So people with 4 or more are quite prone to these conditions. And the more of the numbers that you said yes to on the previous slide, the more of these, or the more likely you are to partake in these activities. But aside from the behaviors, they're often prone to obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide, STDs, broken bones, COPD, stroke, cancer, and heart disease. These are what I referred to earlier as the traumatic baseload. If you did score 4 or more on these, I would recommend at some point talking to a therapist about it, because that is definitely going to add to that traumatic baseload in terms of that backpack I referred to earlier. It's going to be a bunch of rocks in your backpack that you've probably been carrying around for a long time. So those are the 2 factors that I will not say more about, because it's kind of beyond the scope of someone like myself to help with. But I will just reiterate that those are kind of 2 things that are sort of risk factors that are going to be at play, in addition to all the other things that I'm going to be talking about from here on in, which are things we can control. So I talked about ego defense, and I find this kind of interesting, so I'm going to get into a little bit of detail. This is what I referred to earlier as the Psychology 101. So essentially, this is the different mechanisms that your subconscious will use to keep your conscious happy. And if you see the little image on the right, that's kind of the metaphor for Sigmund Freud's conceptual model of the brain. So we have the ego, which is the kind of part of the iceberg that's partly sticking out. In other words, whatever's sticking out is your conscious brain. So your ego is part of your thinking brain, the part that you feel, the part that you're aware of. On the left is that super ego, which is, there's a little bit of it sticking out, which is conscious, but the vast majority of it is subconscious. And the super ego is essentially the little angel on your shoulder, or what I think of as my late grandmother, who's my conscience and who's always telling me to do the right thing, and that I should always, go to church more and be a better boy and not be so mean to my sister, and et cetera, et cetera. Basically, that's my super ego. And then underneath that, purely in the subconscious realm, is your id. And your id is kind of like that little devil on your other shoulder, who's always wanting you to do whatever it takes to feel good. He wants your ego to be happy. He wants your ego to do whatever it takes. And the id will lie to you, and it will make you lie to others. And it's part of all of us. It's something that we all do, whether we know it or like it or not. But the id is always pushing us into ego defense. So if there's a hard truth that we don't want to face, if there's some trauma that our id wants us to avoid, our id will step in, and it will push us into these ego defense mechanisms. So most of these are unconscious and unhealthy. I will point to a couple of that are healthy, but I'll just go through these. And the reason I'm going to go through these in detail is because these are sort of risk factors or risk symptoms that we can see if we're having some sort of a subconscious mechanism hiding some trauma from us or keeping us from actually dealing with it. So if we see ourselves or others or brothers and sisters here in this situation, we want to sort of dig a little deeper and see what's going on. So the first one is denial. Denial is pretty straightforward, refusing to accept facts. Probably everyone knows what denial is. The key point here, though, is that it's not a conscious denial, it's a subconscious denial. There might be some facts that are right in front of us that we just do not accept as reality. Repression is hiding or ignoring feelings. And again, that's typically more of a subconscious thing, although it can be conscious as well, if we're repressing our feelings and keeping them bottled up. Projection is attributing your feelings to somebody else. So an example of this is, I don't know, if you're doing something bad that you feel guilty about, you'll start to suspect other people are doing that. So picture a guy having an affair on his wife. All of a sudden he's goes into fits of rage because he swears his wife's having an affair on him, and he's projecting that guilt onto her. Similarly, displacement, take your anger out on somebody else. This is something that I will admit as a parent I've done. I think every parent on earth has probably done this at some point. Your kid does something fairly minor to you, you totally snap and yell at him or her. I say him because I have 3 boys, but you totally snap and you blow up, and 15 minutes later you're sitting there thinking, what the hell was that about? Why did I just blow up like that? And that's because you've displaced your anger on your poor unsuspecting kid who probably did something to be a pain in the ass, but didn't quite do something to deserve what you blew up on him for. Regression, so escaping reality by emotionally returning to an earlier time. And a classic example of this is people will actually go and start sucking their thumb or going back to their little childhood toy, and people actually do go back and regress emotionally to a toddler when they deal with severe trauma. So sublimation is taking your anger out on something else, but this can actually be in a healthy way. So kickboxing, I used to use squash as my kind of go-to for dealing with stress, because you could just whack that ball over and over again. And so that's a healthy type of ego defense. Reaction formation is another interesting one. This is when you essentially act the exact opposite way to how you're feeling. If you picture Clark Griswold on Christmas Vacation, when he gets the card from the company that says he's got the Jolly of the Month Club, and he was expecting the bonus to buy his pool, and he just realized his whole world blew up on him. And now all of a sudden he's the cheerful, super happy guy. You might have a spouse who does that, not that I do, but yeah, okay. So I do. So if my wife is super happy, I know that, something is wrong. If I'm expecting her to be a little ticked off, but instead she's super happy for some reason, look out. So compartmentalization, this is pretty straightforward too. You've got some stress from work, or you've got some stress from something. You go home and you completely pretend that doesn't exist, and you keep it separate from your family life, which might be fine for your family, but it's going to eat away at you, and it's just keeping you from dealing with a problem. And then intellectualization, this is a little bit like rationalization, but it's really just focusing on facts to avoid your emotions. In fact, I skipped rationalization, but of course that's using selective facts. So say somebody grabs a beer out of the fridge here and has a selective fact like, there was probably some beer donated, I don't need to pay for this one, it's probably one of the free ones. That'll keep me from feeling guilty about not putting the $2.50 in the bin. But then the last one, which is usually healthy, is altruism. People can go too far though. They can basically be self-sacrificing and go a little bit too far and avoid dealing with their own problems, and kind of divert all their attention to helping somebody else at the expense of their own problems. So watch out for those. Those are the ego defense mechanisms. And I'm going to come back to some mechanisms or some coping mechanisms, which are kind of the opposite of those in a bit. But first, let's go through some of the resources. So external resources, of course, family doctor, therapist, they're always there for you. If you need to address a pre-existing traumatic load, you definitely want to go deal with that. But I'm going to talk more about internal resources, and our number one resource is each other. We're all here for each other. We all kind of know what this is all about. Every single person on this department is there to talk to you if you want to talk. I absolutely believe that's the best resource, and it's not just what I believe, but all of the studies that have been done have borne that out. If you have a good support system within your department on a scene, after the scene, in post calls, you are much better off in terms of mental health. So we have all of each other. We also have a formal critical incident stress management team. That's Robson, Artis, and myself. So you can reach out to us if you want to tap into more of the resources that I'm about to talk about. But again, everybody on this department is a resource in terms of your mental health. So now I'm going to get into the standard operating procedures. The objective of this is to manage stress and to reduce the risk of PTSD, but I like to focus more on the proactive measures. So we have proactive measures like a pre-call preparedness, post-incident reviews, and this applies to all calls, not just traumatic calls, and then mental health awareness and coping strategies, which is what we're doing here tonight. So in terms of pre-call preparedness, the standard operating procedure has a new part of a procedure, which I would like to adapt to our calls. And it might sound a little wacky at first, but if you bear with me for a few minutes, I actually think this will make some sense. But this is something I would like us to do on pretty much all calls. Aside from calls that are like a 1-minute drive where this is not possible. But say you're leaving 5-2 and you're driving up to the Big White Turnoff or something, or you're driving up to Philpott, you've got lots of time to do something like this. Even leaving 5-1, if we're going further than say our road or Peregrine, we've got enough time to do this. We usually have our quick check-in with dispatch, and then we kind of chatter a little bit on the way. We've typically got time to do what I'm about to propose. So if you remember back in November, Shirley Hogan had talked about the Big Four. This is her slide. And this was a procedure that was kind of adapted and perfected by the Marines in their training. And it consists of goal setting, mental rehearsal, self-talk, and breathing. And so this isn't actually unique to the Marines. This is used in a lot of other mental health settings, but these are just 4 proven techniques to put you in a successful and high-performing frame of mind. But in addition to just being in a high-performing state of mind, it also puts you in a calm state and will reduce your risk of remaining in that state of hyperarousal. So it consists of mental rehearsal. And if you remember the video that we saw when Shirley was here, or if you weren't there, it kind of showed somebody in the NHL practicing, pretending to be on the ice, skating and scoring. And then he actually went and did that exact move. But this is something elite athletes do all the time. You rehearse in your brain exactly what you're about to go do and perform. And then goal setting. This is setting one very realistic, very achievable goal that you can achieve on a call. And so the goal should be something very simple, like I will lead to a better outcome for one person, or I will keep in close communication with my incident commander, or I will go home safely, or I will help everybody go home safely. Something that you can actually achieve, not something like I am going to go out and save 4 lives, or I am going to be a hero, or something like that. So keep it simple, keep it achievable. That's the absolute key there. And then self-talk, using the goal and the mental rehearsal that you've just been through. Come up with a very simple mantra that you can repeat in your head, something that's only a few words, that is not, again, something that's not too complicated, that kind of reflects that goal. Something like, I will stay calm, or I will stay in touch with IC, or I will follow my commanding officer's lead, or I will lead my crew safely, or something like that, like 5 words at the most, that you can kind of repeat in your brain just for a minute or two and put yourself in that frame of mind where you're calm, you're ready for the call, and you're setting yourself up for success. And then the last thing is breathing. And so there's box breathing. I've listed a couple of different techniques there. The 4-4-4-4 is breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, repeat. And the other 2 numbers are essentially just variations of that. Box breathing is usually the most common. I personally like breathing in for 4 and out for 6. And if you do that for a minute or two, it will take you right out of that amped up sort of high testosterone fight or flight state that you might be in as you're on your way to some traumatic call, wondering what the hell's about to happen. And if you're in that amped up state, you're not thinking clearly, you're not preparing yourself, you're basically just getting ready to jump out and go at it. So what these 4 techniques do collectively is to put you in a frame of mind where you're calm, you have a very realistic, achievable, and defined goal, and you're ready to go do it. Now, keep in mind that no call ever goes exactly how you think it's going to go while you're on your way there, but at least this sets you up for success to start. So what I'd like to do, maybe Robert, you can manage this, is to go into some breakout rooms. And how many officers do we have on the call? Unfortunately, half of our officers are in the back of the hall doing an FR practice.
Goes back there. So we have
Wasiluk.
Yeah, and Captain Anderson.
And I'm going to re-promote firefighter Dumonte as captain if he's willing for this exercise.
And Bose.
Oh, and Bose. So we got 4. So can you divvy 4 rooms?
Sure.
And Anderson, Wasiluk, Bose, if you can give Robert a thumbs up that you acknowledge you're about to be put in a room. So once you get put in a room, pretend that you're on a call and you get your dispatch. Dispatch is bus rollover at the corner of Big White Road. School bus has gone over the bank at the corner of Highway 33 and the Big White turnoff. And I would like you to attempt to do this Big 4 practice as if you're in the apparatus on your way to that scene with your crew. Okay, so let's see if we can implement that. But of course, once you do, let's make sure you give me some feedback and we can adjust things if we need to, or make sure if it's working that we implement it more fully. So getting back to the slides here, this is getting back to the standard operating procedure. I know most people are actually familiar with this already because we've had a couple of incidents where we've used this. So I won't spend a whole ton of time on this, but just know that there's a binder at 5152 with the standard operating procedure in it. And we have 3 different levels of post-incident follow-up. And the first is post-incident reviews. So the incident commander or company officer or team lead, who's ever in the passenger seat, should have at a minimum a post-incident review after any call, except for nuisance calls and BS calls. But any call where we have any sort of real action, there's an opportunity for us to get some feedback. But more importantly, it's actually an opportunity for us to just practice making sure we have that check-in. And if anybody does feel like they need sort of a higher level of post-incident review, then we kick it up to the next notch, which is diffusing. And so as I've got shown here underlined, this can be done at the request of any person at any time. This is intended primarily for traumatic calls where we're going to have a formal process, which is mainly a roundtable where people go through a fairly structured set of questions and answers to help vent, to help get things off their chest, and to help deal with any sort of stress they're carrying. And again, this is also an opportunity to see if we need to take this one level higher, which is a debrief. During a debrief, this would be typically an incident where we have a very, very seriously traumatic event involving maybe a family member of somebody on the department. The only one that I've ever been at was Chief Bewley's daughter, who probably half of the people here were at. That was about 5 years ago. So something like that, we're going to bring in external people to facilitate. But at any stage along the way, we can escalate things as we need to. So we have these processes in place for kind of gathering after a call, depending on how serious it was or how each of us are feeling, we can kind of tailor the post-incident review or the debrief or diffusing to each other. So that's in the hall, in a binder at each hall. So have a look at that if you'd like to. And now I'd like to get to kind of what we can do for ourselves. This is more of the proactive coping mechanisms. And this is what I think of as the more happier side of this talk. So what we're dealing with here is affect regulation, or the ability to control your own emotional state or mood. So first is to be able to recognize those ego defense mechanisms I talked about earlier. And because they are subconscious, it's not just a matter of walking around going, am I in denial? Am I projecting my thoughts onto somebody else? There's actually techniques that we can use that will help us identify those. Because it's almost impossible to just think your way through something like that. And the goal, of course, is to minimize unpleasant experiences and maximize pleasant experiences. And so a lot of these are conscious, but they're also unconscious, and it's just a way of training ourselves to use these coping mechanisms regularly. So if you look at what's available to us, there's lots of different things that we can do. These are all things that I would like to do in these practices at some point. Tonight, I'm really just going to focus on 3. I talked about social support already. We're all here for each other. And particularly if we do this type of exercise, we get better at helping each other. So we are our own social support. I'm going to now focus on locus of control and mindfulness and meditation for the rest of this practice, and talk about exactly how we can use these to our advantage. So locus of control is really one of, people tend to be on one side of the scale or the other. So if you have an external locus of control, you tend to think that other things or people or situations are responsible for your outcomes and the way you feel. If you have a very strong internal locus of control, you feel very strongly that you're in control of situations, you're in control of your emotions, you're in control of how you feel and how you behave. And everybody exists somewhere on that continuum, and you don't want to be all the way one or the other. So if you have an external locus of control, you might end up sort of feeling like a victim because you feel like you can't help yourself and you're waiting for somebody to come and rescue you. If you're too strong on the internal locus of control, you feel like you might get this hero complex, or like you need to save the world, you need to fix yourself, you won't get help from other people, you take too much on yourself. And so it's all about balance. You need to find that happy medium in between where you're doing what you can. And it's all about recognizing what is that proper locus of control, or what is that proper level of control that you can be responsible for. When do you need help from other people? When can you help yourself? And to me, it comes down to the serenity prayer. So God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So the locus of control is all about that wisdom to know the difference. What are the things that I can control? What are the things that I can't control? If it's something that I can control, then what can I do about it? And that gets into the whole concept of productive and unproductive stress. Because if there's something you can't do anything about and you're stressing about it, that's totally unproductive stress. So again, we have 2 guys here, same fire department, sitting there sort of thinking about something after a call. They were at the same call. Something didn't go their way, but they both look at this slightly differently. The guy on the left says, I could have done better. The guy on the right says, I should have done better. And so there's actually it's a subtle difference, but it's actually quite big in terms of what you can do with that information. So he says, I'll do better next time. I'll sign up and get some training. So he's actually taking it upon himself to actually use this as productive stress. The guy on the right is now just going to ruminate. I should have saved that patient. It's my fault she died. And now he's getting into an unproductive stress. He can't go back in time. He can't save her. Maybe there's nothing on earth he could have done. But the point is he's now in a state of unproductive stress. There's nothing that he's telling himself that is going to help him make the situation better. And he's not improving himself for next time. And you may have seen this figure before. This is it's known as the Yerkes-Dodson law. But really what it is it's the level of stress along the bottom and your performance going up on the y-axis. And it's kind of this idealized version of what is that optimal amount of stress. And so at that very center area, you have a good level of stress. It's actually about a moderate level of stress, but it's a very high peak performance. And so we're energized, we're focused, we feel like we can take on the world. And that's a bit of stress pushing us, but not so much that it's going to hold us back. And if you move a little bit over to the right, now you're getting into that continuum of too much stress, which leads to fatigue, exhaustion, and breakdown. And this is a very unproductive position for us to be in, obviously. But it's not as easy as just saying, I need to get back into optimal performance. You need some way to do that, to recognize the things that are keeping you in that state of burnout. If it was as easy as just saying, I need to bring my stress levels down, we'd all be perfectly happy. Now, on the other side, again, there's that feeling of too calm. You're not motivated. You're not actually getting anything done. That's typically not a big problem. You can increase your challenge and your motivation. It's usually being way off on the right, where we need to manage our worry. We need to manage our stress. And typically we'll need some sort of a mechanism or some tool to do that. So looking at a very simplified version of what we want to accomplish, this doesn't actually tell us how to do it, but it kind of breaks down the problem for us. We have some stressful event or some trauma. I'm talking mainly about trauma because we're here on the fire department, but this can actually apply to virtually any kind of stress you would ever face. Depending on how anxious of a person you are, you might have some self-talk. You need to evaluate that and ask yourself what's going through your mind. Are you telling yourself something that can improve the situation? Is that what's going through your mind? Is there a problem that you can actually solve, or is there some problem that you're ruminating over that it's out of your control? So if it's something that you can solve or something that you can learn from, then you can take action. You can be like that guy that we saw 2 slides ago who says, I'm going to take training, I'm going to improve, I'm going to use this stress to my advantage, and I'm going to make it motivate me to get better. And so for that, you can use goal setting, problem solving, you can confront your fears, you can do all of these things that will end up being positive in terms of your productivity. If this is something completely out of your control, so whatever it is you're thinking about, this is some problem that you can't fix, it's something that happened in the past, it's something that's going to happen in the future that you have no control of whatsoever, really all you can do is accept it. And so there's lots of different ways that you can gain acceptance. Typically though, again, it's not just as simple as saying, I'm just going to accept this and I'll be fine with it. There's actually tools that you can use, and we'll go into mindfulness and meditation using that app. That's 2 of the most common. You can use prayer, self-compassion, journaling, or therapy, but you need some way to actually accept things, not just to say, I'm fine with it, because then you're basically just going into denial. You need to actually truly accept the situation if it's something you can't control. So another way of looking at this, of getting from that stressful thought to making peace with that thought, there are lots of different, totally different types of techniques that you can use. I've highlighted 6 of them here, and I'll just talk briefly about them. So meditation is really a way of either using a stillness or a quietness or some sort of positive mantras to make peace with your thoughts, to observe your thoughts, but to distance them from being able to affect you and making peace with them that way. Stoicism is a little different. Stoicism is quite interesting. The Stoics really believe that no matter what your situation was, you should be grateful for it, you should accept it with vigor, and you should make the best of it. And they truly did make that a way of life. And there are some really interesting stories about Stoics who had been sentenced to isolation for many years and sentenced to death and having horrible conditions. But for whatever reason, they were able to look at that and say, I'm going to make the best of this, and I'm going to be happy, even though I know I'm going to be put to death in 6 weeks or whatever. So there's all sorts of really crazy stories about Stoics who were able to use their sort of outlook on life to make the best out of really horrible situations. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a very structured way of identifying what are called cognitive distortions. So if you're fixated on some horribly negative outcome, even though it's extraordinarily unlikely, this is what people with anxiety do, is they fixate on the future. It's often said that people who are anxious live in the future, people who are depressed live in the past. People who are anxious will fixate on some outcome that they may have a tiny bit of control over, but it's usually some uncertain thing in the future that will drive a person crazy. And I know personally, I've had 3 panic attacks this was many years ago, but I know exactly what that feels like. I use cognitive behavioral therapy myself to overcome this. What it does is it helps you identify these thought distortions, recognize them as just being distorted thoughts and irrational thoughts, and be able to look at them objectively and say, this is actually, it's in my head, that's fine. It can stay in my head, but it doesn't need to affect me. And it's really just a process of identifying those and being able to talk back against them and making peace with them. So all of these things lead to making peace with the thought. Journaling allows you to sort of get things off your chest. You might still have those thoughts, but it really amps them down, it tones them down, and you make peace with your thought. There are a couple of different types of physiological hacks that you can do. Some of them are related to breathing, and some of them are related to tensing your muscles in a very defined way and relaxing them and tensing and relaxing and going through different parts of your body and making the stress kind of disappear that way. And this does lead to a biochemical response in your body that actually calms you down. So it's really hacking into your nervous system. And another technique that can actually be combined with these other ones is using gratitude. And what that does is it replaces your negative thoughts with positive thoughts. So all of these are quite different ways, but essentially it all takes you from some stressful thought in the beginning to some way of making peace with it. Now, Robert sent me an audio clip just about 4 hours ago, so I thought I would add that here because it's a good topic. The concept is post-traumatic growth, also known as what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And this is definitely true when it comes to mental health. There's a whole concept of humans being anti-fragile. So we have some trauma, we have some difficulty, whether it's physical or negative. Humans are extraordinarily resilient as species and as individuals. And so overcoming adverse conditions can lead to, and this is again based on large studies of people who have overcome really terrible things. People come out of it on the other side stronger, with a big appreciation of life, better relationships with others, finding new possibilities in life, stronger personal strength, and often spiritual changes, because people go through some traumatic event, they realize what the heck is actually important to them, and they get rid of all sorts of clutter in their lives that have been holding them back, and they come out much stronger on the other side. Now, this is distinct from resilience. Resilience is about avoiding that traumatic situation, or that traumatic, post-traumatic situation in the first place. This is about having some adversity afflict us and us coming back from it. So it's a long, drawn-out process generally, but we come out stronger. So with that, I'm going to talk about this app a little bit, and then I'm going to do a couple of demos, and then I'm hoping we can each try it out. So this is a totally free app. It has a really nice interface. I would recommend everybody download it. I downloaded it 6 weeks ago when somebody recommended it, and I've tried it. And I try it all the time. Typically, it just puts me to sleep, which for me is awesome. I'm super happy if I go into one of these 10-minute meditation routines and I wake up the next morning with the phone laying on my chest. That's pretty awesome to me. So it has all sorts of different categories in the app. Breathing, mindfulness, meditation, grounding, gratitude, self-compassion, sleeping aid. There's actually a whole bunch more. There's probably about 20 different categories. Within each category, there's lots of different little short meditations, all just 5 to 10 minutes. And they also have one where you can try it for 30 days and it's got a series that you can try. Anyway, lots of different stuff in there. You can download it now if you want. If you don't want to download it, that's fine. I'm going to make you sit through just a couple of introductions to it. So the first introduction is like 1 minute, and I'm just going to play it because it kind of explains what the app is all about.
Awareness in the present moment, and you'll soon be able to feel the benefits in your day-to-day life. See you back here soon.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Robert's going to queue up a Kahoot to see who is listening. There's some super easy questions and some hard questions, so hopefully everybody has some fun with that to wrap things up.